I have been giving Mike Johnson a lot of crap. All of it, in my opinion, well-deserved. We have been waiting for a vote on Ukraine aid since last September. Now, I have run through this on this channel a million times, but in the chance, just in the rare chance that if you've been watching this channel for a while or a new viewer and you haven't heard it before, I'll give you guys the rundown of what it's been like since September. So in September, when we had a different House Speaker, yes, this was going on when we still had House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, they were trying to get $24 billion in Ukraine aid passed. And there was talk of attaching it to an extending resolution to continue the budget negotiations or adding it into a budget bill. The Republicans said no, and this was in large part due to a compromise that Kevin McCarthy had to make during his, I would say, semi-historic attempt to go for the speakership, which had a lot of votes and was more than a little bit embarrassing. And that concession was that all it took to cause a recall vote on the House Speaker was a single legislator to stand up and say, recall. That's it. Just took one. Now, this allowed him to get the speakership, but it also meant it empowered the individual Congress members much more. Now, for most Congress members, knowing that it would probably look bad, they didn't want to do that. But this was a concession for the fringe of the party. So if they ever felt that Kevin McCarthy wasn't being, I guess you could say, maybe servile or subservient enough to what they think is the Republican Party's values, or in line enough with what they think is the party's values, they can call a recall vote. And that could be used on all sorts of stuff. But it was also used on Ukraine aid, with Marjorie Taylor Greene, in fact, saying that if there is a vote on Ukraine aid, she will call a recall vote on the House Speaker. Now, she said this multiple times in different ways during this multiple month period between September up to now. But it was, those rumblings were around at the time. And so Kevin McCarthy kind of kicked the can down the road, and it wasn't addressed then. In fact, not only wasn't it addressed then we had the speakership fumble. And so the House speakership was ran over and fought over by not only Kevin McCarthy, but then Jim Jordan, Steve Scalise, Tom Emmer, and then it eventually got to Mike Johnson, not because Mike Johnson has a lot of experience, not because Mike Johnson is a fantastic legislator, not because Mike Johnson, you know, has shown to be above the pale when it comes to legislative rigor. No, it's because, to put it bluntly, nobody hated Mike Johnson or had a dislike of him. And that was, you know, not only due to, you know, him being a pretty stalwart conservative and generally dragging the party line and dragging Trump's line, with him being the champion for Donald Trump's challenge of the election results in 2020 in the House, but also because he's been in there for so few years that it's kind of hard for him to have started many rivalries. Then when you look at people like Steve Scalise, Tom Emmer, these are people who have been in the House much, much, much longer, and therefore have been able to build rivalries. For example, Tom Emmer voted against, he voted in favor, I think it was in 2019, no, I think it was in 2021, in favor of legislation that would codify gay marriage on the federal level outside of the Supreme Court. So we have gay marriage in the United States because of a Supreme Court decision, not because of federal legislation, meaning if it was ever overturned like Roe versus Wade was, and Clarence Thomas has at least suggested a little bit that he'd be open to the idea, then the federal legislation would kick in, and therefore, if Roe versus Wade was overturned, that means all the states that don't already have gay marriage on the state level, which is a lot because they didn't feel a need to do so because it was, you know, it was protected by the Constitution and it was protected by the Supreme Court that came out and said it was unconstitutional to deny their marriage rights. Then this federal legislation would kick in, and he supported it because he looked at the polling data and was like, the majority of Americans support gay marriage, like the vast majority. It's not even close. The country is changing. I want to be part of that change. That's all it took. It wasn't just that, but that was a big contributor as to why he failed. And so Mike Johnson, while of course I don't think Mike Johnson would have came out in favor of that legislation, he's a stalwart Christian conservative, and he in fact has argued, he made legal arguments in favor of criminalizing homosexual activities. To put it, I just call it homosexual activities. You can go look that up yourself. But my point is that he was in there so short that he couldn't make these rivalries. He couldn't make these problems for himself that others would have. And so he became the House Speaker. But because that same rule was in place, he still had to listen to the far right fringe. And now that he was House Speaker, he had to be the Speaker for the majority of the House. Now, himself, he has an abysmal voting record on Ukraine. He's voted against supporting Ukraine in every single bill that's put in front of him, except for the immediate Lend-Lease Act after Ukraine was immediately invaded. Immediately when the heat died down, he put his head underwater, put his head under the ground. So I didn't really expect much from him personally on it, but I knew that a majority of Americans supported Ukraine. I knew that the majority of politicians on the Hill and in the Senate supported Ukraine, and the House too, and the president supported Ukraine, and that he now had to be leader for the party. So I was a little divided, but I was very nervous because of his record, and I expressed it at the time. But he said that he wouldn't abandon it because now he's the leader of the party. And then he proceeded to abandon Ukraine for over 6 months. We're going to go into April now. We're going into April. We're in mid-March, and we still haven't had a vote on Ukraine legislation. And mind you, that was after he made the demand like, look, fine, we can do Ukraine aid, but it has to be tied to border concessions. And so Senator Langford from the Republican side, the senator from Oklahoma, sat down with Democrats like Senator Chris Coons. They negotiated, and they were able to turn up and create some compromise. And that compromise legislation was giving most of the concessions to them. But then Trump sunk it because he didn't want compromise in a election year. Definitely compromise on an issue like immigration, which he is running his campaign on. It wasn't just that. Some of the far-right fringe also thought it didn't go far enough. But you guys shouldn't have been even getting these concessions in the first place tied to Ukraine aid, because you're tying a national security issue to an extremely other national security issue overseas to another issue, which you could say does concern our national security, but these are two separate issues, one of which is incredibly politically divisive, and Trump lost because the American people and because the Democrats disagreed with their immigration policy. So you couldn't expect them to literally give you everything on immigration when you only control one chamber and you have a slim majority at that, a majority that's getting slimmer by the day, mind you. Anyway, it got shot down, and that's the situation we've been in now, where Mike Johnson, in the precarious situation of calling for immigration concessions, being given immigration concessions, but then Trump says, you have to sink it because I don't want a deal. But then he also promised that he wouldn't abandon Ukraine. And he's also got more moderate members of his party, or at least not isolationist members of his party, who are not happy with the fact that we've been holding up this aid for Ukraine. Definitely as we're getting reports from battles like the battle for Avdiivka, the battles for Robatne, the battles from other locations, that the lack of ammunition is starting to contribute to battlefield losses. It's starting to contribute to the Ukrainians having to pull back somewhat. They're lessening their rate of fire. And there are situations where the Ukrainians have the target. They see the target, but they can't fire simply because they don't have the ammunition. And this is not an issue. Like, supplying them with ammunition isn't an issue that's just going to be like, okay, one and done. This is something that's going to take time to invest in. And we have had estimates showing that if we don't do this deal to send Ukraine aid, or if we don't send Ukraine aid and make the investments in our industrial base, not only will this undermine their defense now because we're not sending them shells, we're not sending them the bombs and the weapons necessary to defend themselves, but also we're not making the investments necessary to increase our production. So instead of having 100,000 shells a month by 2025, which would allow us to produce about 1.2 million shells a year on top of European production and on top of Asian production, if we can get them more involved in the effort. We already got 500,000 shells from the South Koreans. But instead of 100,000, it'll be 75,000. A 25,000 decrease, a 20% decrease in artillery production. And when we're trying to supply a country that's fighting in large part an artillery war. So these are decisions which cannot wait because of the immediate prospects of a large-scale Russian spring and summer offensive. And hey, we're in March. I'm sweating like bullets right now. And that's not just because my attic's over the boiler. It's also because we're going into spring. It's getting warm. The Russians, as experts are talking, are thinking about doing large-scale offensive. This is really likely we're going to see a large-scale offensive in summer. They've already taken a lot of losses, but they want to press the initiative due to the ammo shortage. But if they press the initiative and they run into a wall of American iron and other iron from Europe, and if the Ukrainians ready to defend themselves, then that's going to put the Ukrainians in a much better negotiating position and a much better position moving forward. But if we pull back and we wait and we sit on our hands, we could get to a position where we approve aid in May or June or months later, like halfway into the year. We're already a quarter into the year. We're going to be a quarter into the year. We still haven't approved aid. And then we approve aid. And then it's only after some big catastrophe happens, like a big breakthrough. And then Republicans panic, say, oh my gosh, I guess this was a national security priority. I guess the Ukrainians weren't lying about the ammo shortage starting to become critical. And then they're going to approve it. But at that point, how long is it going to take for those shells to be sent over? And those investments need to be made now. Because if we make those investments near mid 2024, near the end of 2024, then it's not like we could just magically increase capacity. It takes time to expand capacity. It takes time to hire workers and people to work the factory lines and work on the machines and to expand capacity. This is all while the Russians are running their factories 24/7, 6 days a week. They're running night shifts. They're going from paying people, like, they're doing increases in pay that are like 200, 300, 400% increases in pay to try to attract people to the arms industry, not only because they're trying to expand it, but also because they're trying to expand it during a labor shortage. Now, the bigger investments that they're making, it's going to take years for them to come back with. To make these bigger factories is going to be like 5-year investment times before they start to see returns on that. Because what they're doing right now is benefiting from the excess capacity from existing factories. So this would be the time for us to take advantage of that limitation and not allow them to take the initiative and run away with it while we sit on our hands for just completely partisan reasons. But now, as more reports come out, that new CNN report about artillery shells, even if I don't like how it was framed, they talk about the entirety of Russian artillery production to get to the 3 million shells a year, but then they only compare it to 155 artillery production in the West, not talking about 122 artillery or the other types of artillery. I didn't like the framing, even though the general idea of it, which is the Russians are increasing artillery production, we shouldn't be sitting on our hands. I think that's true. The pressure's building. The discharge petition, which is a way to go around Mike Johnson, it would be another loss, another humiliating loss for him if the House decided to go around him and more members of his party jumped to go with Democrats and voting in favor of this discharge petition. And let me just say, this morning, I know more Democrats from New Jersey's 3rd, Andy Kim. He signed on this morning. I know others are signing on this morning. I know others are going to be signing on in the weeks ahead. More people are signing on to this discharge petition. The pressure is building. I know Brian Fitzpatrick, the Republican who supports Ukraine, who floated that he would sign a discharge petition, and he knows other Republicans that would sign a discharge petition. He said he wanted to get this thing going to add pressure to Mike Johnson. And so now he's starting to crack a little. It feels like he's starting to crack a little. Or at the very least, somebody kicked him in the ass and told him, if you wait too long, they might very well go around you and you'll have another humiliating loss on your hands. This will be more humiliating than the time they failed the first impeachment vote. It'll be more humiliating than the loss of Ken Buck, which happened without his knowledge very recently. It could be more humiliating than any of those losses if they did this, use this provision, a discard petition, to go around him in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time. Definitely if it's done successfully, because most discharge petitions are taken away and they're not gone through with because they work as a pressure tool. But if it doesn't work as a pressure tool here, it actually goes through successfully, that will be historically significant and historically humiliating. And so I think that, combined with pressures from within his party, combined with him losing House members day by day, with now his House majority shrunken to 218 because of the loss of Ken Buck, that he might be getting a little kick in the ass, and he wants to show that he at least is moving in the direction of Ukraine aid. And to me, this is a really good sign. And so on this, we've been waiting and waiting and waiting for good signals. This is the first really good signal we've seen in a while outside of the discharge petition from the Republican side. From Mike Johnson, though, most importantly, from him, the person who has the power to bring it to the House floor. Now, again, he might still end up wanting to do some much smaller bill. In fact, I would say there's a good chance that might be the circumstances. He might end up trying to do something to pass legislation that's not as good or not as expansive as the aid section in the bill currently waiting to be put on the House floor. But it looks like he's trying to move. Let's read a little bit about this. Speaker Mike Johnson told Politico that he expects to pass a future Ukraine assistance bill with Democratic votes, an acknowledgement of the persistent resistance to any new aid within the GOP. Johnson said in a Thursday interview at the House Representatives Republican retreat. Now, something that's interesting about this House Republican retreat is that a lot of Republicans said they wouldn't be going to this House Republican retreat because of how bad the divisions are. And I believe one House Republican even commented, I'd rather have someone cut out my own liver and feed it to me than go to the House Republican retreat. So it seems at the moment, you know, divisions within the Republican Party and at this retreat are pretty irritating for House leadership, huh? Let's just put it that way. Johnson said in a Thursday interview at the House Republican retreat that aid to both Ukraine and Israel could come up as one or even two separate bills. Now, honestly, here's my view. If we could vote on aid to Ukraine and aid to Israel separately on the House floor, that would be what I would prefer. Because I feel like these two issues are disconnected enough that you could vote on them singularly. Same with the Taiwan aid, personally. Because I could end up being like, you know what, I want to vote in favor of Ukraine aid, I want to vote in favor of Taiwan aid, but until there's a review on this, or for the incursion into possibly Rafah, I don't want to vote for the Israel aid. That option should be made available to House members, because I know that there are people in the House that would vote in favor of Ukraine aid, but would not vote in favor of Israel aid. Now, there's also, now somebody can make the argument there's an added pressure by connecting Israel aid to Ukraine aid, because Israel aid is almost guaranteed to pass, where Ukraine aid is a little bit more precarious due to it becoming a more politically divisive issue, and there's much less opposition to Israel aid. But on principle, I still think it should be divided. Now, if the Israel aid is gonna pass and the Ukraine aid might not pass, and you wanted to attach one to the other to try to force it through, I can acknowledge the kind of the political maneuvering of that, if that is the circumstances. But in ideal scenarios, I would prefer it that way. But I wouldn't want this to be used as an opportunity to water down the Ukraine aid, especially after we've sat on our hands for so long and disgraced ourselves to the point where we're looking through the couch cushions to try to see what we can give the Ukrainians, which, I mean, we gave the last package the Biden administration just gave them, the $300 million. That was done by literally scraping the bottom of the barrel. Okay, not literally as in they were going through a barrel, but they were going through savings through contract sales for weapons manufacturers and gathering them up over several years to be able to get to that $300 million to give Ukraine. And then within 24 hours of that being announced, Denmark promised Ukraine more aid in their recent aid package, $330 million. Denmark was able to get more for Ukraine in their recent aid package than us. Denmark. I think their GDP is like 23 billion. What is Danish GDP? Oh, no, I was way off. 398 billion. Okay, but what's American GDP? Oh, yeah, that's a little bit of a difference. Slight difference. Anyway, continuing. Johnson, I already said that. I think it is a standalone. I suspect it will need to be on suspension, Johnson said of foreign assistance. I imagine part of the reason why he wants it separate is because delegates like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are from Georgia, are very pro-Israel. They're supposedly America first, like they're principled isolationists. But she also wants to send aid to Israel because God, but not Ukraine, because baby organ harvesting. By the way, I don't know if you guys saw, but did you guys see she had a big meeting, or she's going to have a big meeting on the 19th of this month on baby organ harvesting? I'm sure that'll be an on-the-rails event. The Louisiana Republican added in clear terms that he sees no path to attaching the forward aid to a larger spending bill to keep the government open. That's something we could do right now, by the way, to try to keep, just saying. The suspension calendar requires a 2/3 majority to approve legislation on the House floor, meaning Johnson would need a substantial number of Democratic votes. He has taken that approach with many contentious measures so far in his speakership. He added in an interview that splitting Ukraine and Israel aid into two separate bills was under consideration. The speaker's remarks are the most definitive he has made so far on his plans for tens of billions of dollars in foreign aid that has languished in Congress for many weeks. Even after the Senate cleared its own bipartisan package last month, they represent the clearest move Johnson has made to commit to a floor vote on Ukraine aid, despite significant disinterest in his own party and any new funding for Kiev's efforts against Russia's, and I'm going to add some words at the end, illegal invasion. Okay, so to me, oh, also, I do want to throw out there that after this was announced, Mitch McConnell went out there and said, hey, you should pass the Senate bill, pass the Senate bill. He's been hitting that really hard as he's going to be resigning from, not resigning, but he's not going to be running for re-election. He's going to be, going into retirement, so to speak, as he's ending, going into his elder years as a turtle statesman. To me, this shows that he's forced himself into a corner and he's trying to find a way out. He's trying to find some crack, some weakness in a defense so he can maneuver his way out of this with his speakership intact and with this issue having been voted on while still pleasing the fringe of his base enough to keep his speakership intact. Because something that interested me is that around this, I don't know if it's actually down here or if it's included in the rest of this, but Mike Johnson does go on to say that come next session, he does not want to have the option for one single House member to call a recall vote. I think he's come to the conclusion that having it so any schmuck in your party, no matter how diluted, it could have been George Santos when he was in there, could call a recall vote, possibly sink your speakership, and use that as leverage and use the chaos that would impose on your speakership as leverage to stop any compromise on anything. And so I think he's found this has given him very little wiggle room to compromise with Democrats, which is necessary when you need to do things like running the country when the Democrats control the Senate and the presidency. You can't let the country fall apart when you ask Americans one of their top 3 issues. I think number 2 is Democrats and Republicans working together. And I don't think they're saying, oh, I want you guys to work over to screw over working people. I think they're saying, hey, I don't like it when you guys shut down, put all these federal employees on furlough, close down all the national parks, spark lack of confidence in investors from around the world. I maybe not that last one, but that's something that, worries me. I think that he wants to avoid that. And so that's not something he wants next time. And so since that's the conditions he's under now, he's trying to find some way out. And if he allows the discharge petition to go around him, it could be that that's so humiliating after the loss of Ken Buck that could push people to say, we can't have this guy's House Speaker. I mean, one humiliation after the other. And so he's in the discharge petition puts a timer on it, because once a discharge petition is introduced, once it gets the necessary signatures, I think it's the first and third Monday of every month, they can have a vote on the discharge petition. So while of course that could be a month to like 2 months away, the clock is ticking. And if that does happen to him, that would be a historical humiliation. And so this would be my advice. Don't let go. Do not let go. Do not smell, and and I mean this completely politically, I'm going to forebode this because we know how rhetoric can be interpreted. When you smell a little blood in the water, you shouldn't step back and admire your work. I used to box and I had this problem where I would hit somebody and I'd be like really satisfied, like, hey, I hit him. And so I'd step back to admire my work. And it's not only amateur boxers do this, professional boxers do it as well. Don't do that. See the blood, be like, oh, great, we can get more blood. We can get more blood. So he gets out of my ocean. So he gets out of my water. So he gets out of my ring. So he gives us the Ukraine aid bill and lets it have a vote. And that's what's so crazy about this. This is all negotiation, not over, hey, can we get a majority of votes to support it in the House? We've had that since September. We've had that always. We've always had enough votes to pass Ukraine aid in the Senate and in the House. And we've always had the support of the President of the United States for Ukraine aid. We've always had that. The problem isn't votes. The problem is that Mike Johnson won't even allow us to have a vote. And that's what we're negotiating. That's what we've been negotiating since September. Whether or not he will even allow the vote to take place and let the government, let their elected representatives voted on by the people decide if we support our allies like the majority of Americans do. Just saying. I think the majority of Americans support Ukraine. Pew Research data suggests that. Other data from CNN suggests that recently. Majority of people elected in the House support that. Majority of people elected in the Senate. President supports it. Just let a vote happen. Just do the vote. Don't back off. Keep calling your representatives. Keep trying to build the pressure. And don't let go. Don't let go. Because if we can speed this process up, then maybe he'll feel some heat under his ass and get moving.